I'm Paul Brown, and I started writing articles for technical magazines when I was 17. Between then and now, I have been a writer, editor, and publisher for magazines like Android User, Ubuntu User, Raspberry Pi Geek, and Linux Magazine, among others in both English and Spanish. That is back when print tech magazines were a thing, of course. Writing for magazines that had to be sold on newsstands meant having to compose technical documentation which was both pedagogical and entertaining. Spend enough time doing that and editing other people's text to do that, and you end up developing techniques that help make your writing more accessible. You don't really know who your audience is or how much they're going to know. Internal documentation aimed initially at a very specific group of people is often pushed out elsewhere because it is good enough or we don't have time or money to change it. Your documentation may be used in more ways than you originally anticipated. Daryl from sales may need to convince a client of the benefits of the product, and all he has to build his case upon is your technical manual. Your boss may need to convince the big boss not to cut funding to the IT department, even though big boss doesn't really understand many of the aspects of IT. When big boss says, "All right, give me some stuff I can read so I can make an informed decision," all your boss has for her is your technical manual. Someone asks you to adapt your technical manual into a user manual. Finally, do it for your own sake. Over time, you develop a blind spot that stops you from seeing your writing devolve into technobabble. I'm going to give you a moment to try and digest that text. Moving on, I'm pretty sure that the amount of jargon in your writing increases the longer you spend working in a given niche. The first most obvious thing you can do to make your writing more accessible is work on buzzwords and jargon. Let's start with an example. Visitors to the Kirigami website were expected to figure out what Kirigami is from this sentence. This is the first sentence they would read on the website. What is the problem? Kirigami is the name of the thing, so nobody knows what it is yet. Lightweight is a buzzword. Interface is jargon. Framework is jargon. Mobile is jargon. Convergent is jargon and the buzzword. Applications is jargon. People say programs. The only common English words in that sentence are is, a, for, and. I work a lot with software developers who build graphical programs for end users. Apart from application, other favorite words include mobile, desktop, environment, and framework. I ask people who use computers but are not techies about these words. Mobile is a phone. A desktop is a rectangular piece of wood with legs that supports your stapler, pens, and mouse. An environment is where wild animals and plants live. And a framework is a bunch of shelves. Not even when I gave my interviewees the context of computers, we're talking about computers, were they able to come up with anything close to what these terms mean for my colleagues. Then there is the thing with acronyms. Here is another example. And again, let's enjoy this moment. Apart from being heavy on the buzzwords and jargon, it is even more difficult to understand because of the acronyms. UI and HIG, or WI and I, are a couple of classics in my niche, but unknown outside it. They both describe easy concepts though. The obvious course of action is to unfold the acronyms. UI translates to user interface and HIG to human interface guidelines, which helps a bit, but not much. They are still very jargony. If you feel you must use jargon and acronyms, add an explanatory sentence early on. The user interface, UI, is what the user sees, the workspace, buttons, menus, etc., the visible part of an application. You can even pepper these explanations or variations thereof subtly through the first chapter or so. What the user sees in the user interface is ... The dialogues and menus you can see in the user interface ... etc. It will make your first few chapters longer, but do it enough and by chapter 3 you can use your acronyms confidently without fear of losing your reader. That said, from time to time, throughout your documentation, you may want to throw in the unfolding explanation to keep the meaning fresh in the reader's mind. The other thing you have to pepper your docs with is examples. Ideally, examples will include not only how to use the tech, but also what the tech would be used for. This rules out Hello World. Instead, you can explain how an analog to digital converter chip works by hooking a potentiometer up to a Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pis cannot read analog signals, and then using the contraption as a paddle in a game of blockout. Or you can explain the concept of video tracking by stabilizing a clip of some daredevils doing stunts on their motorbikes. Or you can explain how to use Linux's GPS daemon by having a laptop read a GPS signal from a mobile phone while you drive around in your car. But select your examples carefully. Make sure they wrap tightly around what you want the reader to focus on. That is, the bits that are not about the subject matter of your documentation should be minimal and or self-explanatory, or explained elsewhere, maybe in someone else's docs. One thing you should avoid are metaphors. They don't help. Your product is not like a tram, a bowl of rice, or a squeaky toy, unless of course it is really one of those things. Metaphors invariably fail sooner or later and only create confusion. Using them in documentation is like requiring your reader to climb to the top of your building by leading them to the stairs in another building. So, to summarize, translate jargon, expand acronyms, use practical examples, and avoid metaphors. Digging out a baseline for your documentation is not such an obvious technique as the ones we saw before, but once you find it, it will help you focus your writing and grab the attention of your readers. Building your text from the baseline up makes them more intelligible and easier to understand. This is the template for all baselines. The thing will improve something for someone. The thing is the technology, product, whatever your documentation is about. The something is the issue it solves, what it makes better. The someone is the person or people the thing benefits, usually the readers you are targeting. Daryl from sales will want to know about the glossy new features the product comes with so he can use them as a selling point. Big boss, we want to know how IT contributes to fatten the bottom line for the shareholders. And the end user, we want to know how the product makes their life better before going into anything else. Let's take some of the examples we talked about before and figure out their baselines. Here are the first lines from a technical description of an analog to digital converter chip. As usual, take a moment to digest that. I mean, fair enough, this is from a data sheet. It has to be highly technical. But you wouldn't write the introduction of a chapter on ADCs like that. Instead, think of the reader and dig out the baseline. The thing is an analog to digital converter chip. The something it improves is that it provides a way to read data from analog sensors like potentiometers, thermometers, altimeters, etc. The people who benefit are owners of computers that lack analog input lines, which is most of them. Written out in your documentation, it could read something like this. An analog to digital converter chip, or ADC for short, lets you read data from analog sensors like potentiometers, thermometers, and altimeters into a computer that lacks an analog input line, like the Raspberry Pi. The video effects software described the tracking feature like this. This description is much less acceptable since it is supposed to be from a manual. It gives no indication to the reader why or how she can use this feature, and it includes details that serve no purpose and are completely unhelpful. Again, looking for a baseline comes in useful. The video tracking feature automatically follows the movement of an object in a clip, and you can use it to stabilize the video around said object so you don't have to do it frame by hand. The introductory sentence to Linux's GPS daemon is quite good. It tells you clearly what it is, but it also goes into a bit too much detail. Again, we can improve it by digging out its baseline. Linux's GPS daemon reads data from an external GPS device, and it is useful for developers who need to integrate location data into their programs that run on machines that don't have a GPS device. I think more or less anywhere, and not only to introduce the topic of your text. You can use a baseline to explain a component, an underlying technology, or a feature. Take the following. It is from a list of new features in the Linux kernel I was asked to rewrite. Take a moment. A little research and some digging to reach the baseline allow me to rewrite it like this. The chatty tone was required by the piece, but you could have written that paragraph more formally and it would have still been easier to understand than the original. Note also how the rewritten version contains essentially the same information as the original. The original is just obtuse. Dig out a baseline to kick off your text, yes, but also every time you're about to begin a new section, anytime you introduce a new topic, or simply have a tricky paragraph you're not sure how to approach. The aim is that your reader, regardless of their level of technical knowledge, can always come away with a broad idea of what you're talking about. If you start by listing features or the libraries used, stating what the thing is instead of what it is used for, or forgetting about your audience entirely, and all these things happen way more often than you think, the chances of you never getting through but to a small number of readers is virtually guaranteed. Not much longer, I promise. Before we finish, I must warn you that you can seemingly adhere to the baseline formula and still produce gibberish. The problem here is too much jargon and terms so vague that they are meaningless. What kind of systems are they talking about, for example? And no, the context did not help. Doesn't everything consume and produce data in one form or another? What does empower even mean? This is the most pointless word. If there is one thing you take away from this talk, let it be to never use empower. The baseline cannot help you if your words are rubbish. Which brings us full circle back to not only talking about the baseline, but also the individual words you should avoid and change. How did our friends at Kirigami do, for example? Quite well, it turns out. As a reminder, here's the original again. Kirigami is a lightweight interface framework for mobile and convergent applications. And here is the version with a reworked vocabulary and a baseline focus. Kirigami. Build apps that adapt beautifully to phones, desktop computers, and everything in between. You may argue that apps is jargon, but one gibber out of 14 words is not bad. As for the baseline, the thing is Kirigami. The thing it improves is how it facilitates building beautiful apps for phones and computers. And build is an imperative, so the beneficiary is you. Here's the acronym heavy example we mentioned at the beginning of this talk. New controls were added to aid with the agile crafting of By setting a clear baseline and translating jargon and acronyms to human, we added new controls to help you quickly create graphical applications that work on both desktop and mobile platforms. Our development software makes all your apps look good and fit into all environments. Which, sure, it is 33% longer than the original, but dare I say 100% more intelligible? And that's what this is all about. Thank you.